This is a special episode focused on a crash that occurred this week when a Bonanza lost power on takeoff and did a 180-degree turn back to the airport. From eyewitness reports, we know a little about what happened, and even just 4 to 5 days later, we can still identify one thing the pilot could have done that might have changed the outcome. Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation. My name is Max Trescott. I've been flying for 50 years. I'm the author of several books and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. And my mission is to help you become the safest possible pilot. Earlier in the week, in episode 340, we talked with airline careers coach Carl Valeri about the current state of pilot hiring at the airlines. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/340. And if you're new to this show, welcome. Glad you found us. If you would, take a moment right now and on whatever app that you're using, touch either the subscribe key or if you're using the Spotify or Apple Podcast app, the follow key so that next week's episode is downloaded for free. And let me remind you that this is a listener-supported show, and we have several ways that you can show your love and support for the show. Just go out to our support page at aviationnewstalk.com/support, where you'll find links to support the show via Patreon, PayPal, Venmo, and Zelle. And when you make a donation, I'll read your name on the show. And now let's talk about the fatal crash that occurred on Monday of a Beechcraft A36 at the MacArthur Airport in Long Island. The pilot and passenger were killed. The aircraft took off at about 6:15 p.m. local time, so it was still daylight, and almost immediately had engine problems and turned back to land at the airport. Here's the ATC audio from liveatc.net.
The Bonanza 810 Whiskey, hold short of 24, I got an aircraft crossing the park time. Hold short 24, 810 Whiskey, wind 180 at 11, runway 25 Bravo, clear for takeoff. 24 Bravo, clear for takeoff, 810.
And 63 seconds later, we hear this audio.
Southwest 2893, just hold position, we had a crash in the airport.
For hold position, Southwest 2893.
The NTSB stated that an airport employee witnessed the takeoff, reported that the aircraft engine was popping and sputtering during the takeoff, that the aircraft climbed to about 150 feet, and then returned to the airport. There's virtually no ADSB data available because the aircraft was so low. I can tell you that runway 24 is 7,006 feet long, and that a takeoff from intersection Bravo would leave about 4,000 feet of runway in front of the aircraft and about 3,000 feet behind it. I've looked at all of the crash photos I could find, and the aircraft appears to have crashed just short of runway 6, off to the right of the runway. The wreckage was pointed in a northeast direction, so presumably it did a 180-degree turn to return to the runway. It appears to have crashed in a left wing low orientation. Most of the left wing appears to have broken off, and the left main landing gear, which appears retracted, is bent up 90 degrees along the side of the fuselage. The engine is largely separated from the aircraft and bent perhaps 40 degrees to the right, so the aircraft likely hit in a left wing low and nose low attitude. Now, I've looked at Google Maps, and the last quarter of runway 24 is surrounded by buildings and houses, so at low altitude, there doesn't appear to be any good landing places. A wooded area starts about 4,000 feet beyond the end of the airport property, but the aircraft may have been too low to reach that area. Even so, a lot of pilots are reluctant to crash into trees, especially when there's a runway behind them, even though it might be a safer choice in some cases to go into the trees. Now, for decades, the FAA has referred to these 180-degree kinds of turns as the impossible turn and has urged pilots to land straight ahead rather than return to the airport after a takeoff engine failure, as completing that turn is much more difficult than pilots imagine. Most people think of it as a 180-degree turn, but as you come out of the turn, you'll be offset from the runway. So after completing that turn, you'll then need to make back-to-back 90-degree turns for a total of 360 degrees of turning, though not all in the same direction. Now, you may have seen a video produced by one of the aviation organizations that demonstrated making the impossible turn with various aircraft types. Ironically, one of the aircraft in that video that was unable to complete the turn was a Bonanza, just like the accident aircraft. The reason it's much harder for faster aircraft, such as a Bonanza or a Cirrus, to complete the impossible turn is because of their higher airspeeds. Turn radius is a function of the square of the airspeed. So for an aircraft with a 50% faster speed, it will have a turn radius that's 1.5 times 1.5 times larger, or 2.25 times the turn radius of the slower aircraft. So, for example, after a 180-degree turn, a slower aircraft might be only offset 1,000 feet from the runway, whereas an aircraft that's 50% faster will be offset by 2,250 feet from the runway, making it much more difficult to return to the runway from which you took off. And while you might not make it to the runway from which you took off, you might be able to make it to a crossing runway or taxiway at airports with more than one runway. MacArthur Airport has 2 other runways, but both of them are on the north side of the field, out of reach for this aircraft. Now, of course, hindsight is 20/20, but there is one thing this aircraft could have done differently that might have resulted in a different outcome. Recall that instead of using the full length of runway 24, the Bonanza made an intersection departure at taxiway Bravo. Had this aircraft used the full length of the runway, its flight path would have been offset 3,000 feet or half a nautical mile to the north. And all things being equal, instead of coming up just short of the runway, it would have been able to reach a point 3,000 feet further north. That would have potentially put it within range of taxiway Whiskey, which is a north-south taxiway, taxiway Sierra, which runs east-west, and runway 6, which runs northeast and southwest. So it would have potentially had the option of landing in virtually any direction on one of these surfaces if it had only used the full length of the runway for takeoff. Why might the pilot have decided to take off from an intersection rather than the full length? Looking at the airport diagram, I can see that all of the FBOs are closer to the taxiway Bravo intersection than they are to the beginning of runway 24. If you taxi at 10 knots, traveling that extra 3,000 feet would take about 3 minutes. And I've heard from a listener who's flown with a pilot, and he said the pilot's home airport is only 2,900 feet long. So it would have been easy to rationalize that 4,000 feet is still nearly 40% longer than the pilot's home runway, so why take the time to use the full length of the runway? And yes, I have at times done an intersection takeoff rather than taxi back to the full length of the runway, but I rarely do it anymore and can't remember when I last did it. What I do remember is my 3 most recent flights out of the San Jose International Airport during just the past week. Each time we were in a Cirrus SR-22 and doing our run-up in the run-up area adjacent to taxiway Delta. And from taxiway Delta, you can do an intersection takeoff on runway 30 left and still have 6,300 feet of runway available. But all 3 times, we opted to use the full length of the runway instead because we wanted to use the full 8,400 feet of runway available. Crazy, you think? Yes. Crazy like a fox. Because when I'm taking off, I'm not thinking about the minimum amount of runway I need to take off. Instead, I'm thinking about how much runway can I possibly get in case things go badly. I remember a study of airline captains in which they compared those who'd had incidents during their career with those who hadn't had any incidents. And the only difference they could come up with was that the pilots with no incidents in their career were a little more paranoid than those who'd had incidents. So when you're flying, being a little paranoid can be a good thing. And when you have a choice between making an intersection takeoff and using the full length of the runway, that extra runway could come in handy if you have an emergency. When I'm taking off, I'm on high alert, and I'm expecting something to go wrong. And I'm constantly updating my intended landing areas ahead of me should the engine fail. Now, that's no guarantee that I won't someday find myself boxed in with no place in front of me to land. But knowing where I'll go at every stage of the climb out will definitely shorten the time it takes me to realize that I need to push on the stick and start heading for the spot that I've already chosen. And I've also changed my pre-takeoff briefing. In the Cirrus, we're typically planning to land straight ahead if we lose an engine below 500 or 600 feet AGL, depending upon the model we're in. Since I'm constantly looking for places to land if the engine fails, I tell clients that if it fails before we reach the minimum parachute altitude, I'll take the controls and land while they'll attempt to restart the engine. And failing that, they'll shut off the fuel and the mixture and the batteries. And frankly, calling the tower, that's our lowest priority, as we want to spend what little time we have managing the emergency. Again, hindsight is 20/20, and after every accident, the answers to us as bystanders appear obvious. But to some degree as pilots, we make our own luck. And I hope the next time you're offered an intersection takeoff, you'll get just a little paranoid and use the full length of the runway instead. By the way, the listener I heard from who's flown with the accident pilot said, as a very competent pilot with lots of slow flight and short field experience in the aircraft, he surely didn't make any impossible turn decisions lightly. With the options he was facing ahead, he was calling upon all of his experience in hopes of a more survivable outcome. And now let me share a few things from episode 68, which was called 10 Things to Know About the Impossible Turn After a Takeoff Engine Failure Emergency. Now, I'm just going to read the 10 things now, but I hope you'll take the time to go and listen to the entire episode, which you can find at aviationnewstalk.com/68. Number 1, when the engine quits on takeoff, land straight ahead. Don't turn back to the runway unless you have no other good options. In the case of the Bonanza, it appears that he was surrounded by buildings, and while turning back may have been a poor option, it may have been the only one available. Number 2, understand that your lizard brain will take over in an emergency, and it will tell you to turn back to the runway. The runway is always so appealing. It feels like a safe haven, and every instinct will tell you to turn back to it unless you actively tell yourself not to do it. One thing that helps is to do a pre-takeoff briefing in which you say aloud that if the engine quits below some minimum altitude, you will land straight ahead. And when I say straight ahead, you might turn 30 or 40 degrees to the left or the right to reach the best possible landing spot. In my mind, that is straight ahead compared with turning back 180 degrees to the runway. Number 3, understand that people die trying the impossible turn. And sometimes they die with CFIs on board. There was an accident about 20 years ago in which a non-CSIP instructor decided to simulate the impossible turn with a client from a runway in Southern California in a Cirrus SR-20. They did not make it back to the runway, and they both died. By the way, the impossible turn is not a procedure in any Cirrus training document. So this instructor was not following Cirrus guidance. He just apparently had seen this demonstrated in some other aircraft and decided to try it in an aircraft with which he was not properly trained. Bad move. When you choose a CFI, choose one who has lots of experience in the plane you want to fly. Number 4, teaching and practicing the impossible turn at low altitudes is malpractice. In the case I mentioned, the CFI took off, climbed to 500 or 600 feet, pulled the engine, and turned back to the airport. Practicing the impossible turn like this is dangerous, and you shouldn't do it. Instead, if you feel compelled to practice it, you should not start from the surface, but instead from some safe altitude above the runway. And by the way, I'm not even recommending that you try this at all. I'm just saying that having lots of altitude before you simulate this has to be safer than starting it from the surface. Number 5, there is almost always a better alternative to turning back to the runway. For airports you fly out of frequently, scout the possible landing areas in advance. At my home airport, from the time I rotate until the time I reach the minimum parachute altitude, there are 5 possible landing areas that I'm watching and evaluating during the climb. Some of them are attainable for only a few seconds, but I'm constantly evaluating which of those 5 I will go to at different altitudes during the climb. Call me paranoid, but somehow I've survived over 12,000 hours of flying in GA aircraft. Number 6, it's not a 180-degree turn to go back to the runway. It's far more complicated than that. As I mentioned before, if you turn to the right 180 degrees, you'll be offset from the runway. What you really need to do is turn to the right for 270 degrees and then turn left 90 degrees to be lined up with the runway. Of course, you could also start the first turn to the left. Number 7, choosing the optimal bank angle to get back to the runway will be very tricky. If you choose a steep angle, you'll complete the turn more quickly and have a smaller turn radius, which can be an advantage. Number 8, the steeper your bank angle, the more rapidly stall speed rises, and you increase the chance of stalling in a turn. Now, I'm not going to recommend a particular bank angle because I don't practice the impossible turn and I don't plan to do it, so I certainly don't pretend to know how you should do it. Number 9, you might make it back to the runway, and if you do, you'll be landing with a tailwind. Typically, planes take off into the wind, and the wind is rarely calm. So if you do make it back to the runway, you'll have a tailwind which will increase the required landing distance. Number 10, always do a pre-takeoff briefing before you take off. I really believe that when we speak aloud about the actions we plan to take in a given situation, that we're programming our brain to do those steps, and we greatly increase the chances of doing what we've just briefed. So always do a pre-takeoff briefing and talk about what you'll do at each step of the takeoff if you have an issue or lose power. And above all, train, train, train. I've talked with a number of pilots who've had in-flight emergencies, and the thing I hear most often is that these pilots followed their training, and that's how they were able to survive. So get the best possible training you can get and train often. And if you've been listening to this show for a while and you find value in these episodes, and I'm guessing you do as you stuck around for the entire episode, I'd like to invite you to become a supporter and support the work I'm doing. And there are lots of ways to support the show, so please choose one that works for you. One very tangible way you can do that is to donate. Most episodes take close to 20 hours for me to produce, and that's time I can't be out doing my job, instructing people primarily in serious aircraft. So your financial support makes it easier for me to take time away from instructing so I can create these episodes for you. And you can get some goodies when you support the show. I haven't talked about this much recently, so let's take a minute to do that. First, I read the name of everyone who donates. And it's kind of cool for you and your family to hear your name mentioned on a podcast, so there is that. And for people who sign up on Patreon to make a monthly donation, we have different tiers set up starting at $8 a month, which is about $100 a year. And if you choose to donate a little more at that $20 a month level, you can watch the videos I create. So for example, in the past 2 weeks, Patreon supporters have seen a 39-minute video of me flying the Loft Dynamics virtual reality simulator that we talked about in episode 338. And there's also an 8-minute video of me flying the Skyrise 1 simulator, which is a Robinson R66 helicopter flown with a single control stick, which we talked about in episode 339. And as much fun as it is hearing about these simulators, believe me, it's way cooler to actually see what it was like, which is why I post these videos for Patreon supporters. And at the $35 a month level on Patreon, people can also get free access to my online courses, which are for the G1000, both VFR and a separate IFR course. And then there's a third course on flying GPS and WASP-type instrument approaches. And at the $50 a month level, you'll get a copy of one of my books, and it will include a personal inscription and my signature. So to support the show financially, please take that maybe 3 minutes it will take you to go out on the web to aviationnewstalk.com/support. That's aviationnewstalk.com/support, where you can choose an option to sign up to support the show. You can also support the show whenever you buy a Lightspeed headset. I've been using only Lightspeeds for over 25 years, and I currently own 4 of them. My favorite is the new Lightspeed Delta Zulu headset. In addition to being the quietest headset they make, it features a carbon monoxide detector that issues CO level warnings throughout the headset. And it also has a built-in frequency equalizer you can custom tune to your ears to compensate for any potential hearing loss. And when you decide to buy one or more Lightspeed headsets, they will send us a check for each headset you buy. But only if you get to their website by first going to my website. So when you're ready to buy, go to aviationnewstalk.com/Lightspeed. Not only will you get a great headset, but you'll also be supporting the show. So until next time, fly safely, have fun and keep the blue side up, and remember that you can always go around.